This law, Roy Beck, this new legislative initiative in Puerto Rico, be a test case for something much more far-reaching about how to determine who's where, who belongs where, and who's who?
Well, it does sound like a bit of a test case for Senator Schumer. Senator Schumer is certainly given a lot of signals that he wants to create something that would be maybe like a national identification card or some, he wants to move to a more reliable ID cards to fight fraud at the workplace in particular. My organization, NumbersUSA, does not actually advocate going as far as Senator Schumer does on that. We don't oppose it as long as it's not used to delay other things that are in place, like E-Verify. But I would say that Congressman Schuler, a Democratic congressman from North Carolina, his SAVE Act not only requires mandatory E-Verify, but to fight identity fraud would require that the Social Security Administration notify every person whose Social Security card number is being used in multiple workplaces. And this would be a way to allow the legal U.S. residents and citizens to know that their identity has been stolen. It also is a way to warn the people who are illegally using it that somebody's on to them. But one thing we know is that E-Verify, without going after the identity fraud, only deals with maybe about half of the illegal workers in the workforce.
Marc Rosenblum, when you're in western Puerto Rico, it's easy to see the Border Patrol because they know that people are trying from other Spanish-speaking countries in the Caribbean are trying very hard to get to Puerto Rico because they think they can perhaps game the system once they get there and become Puerto Rican with documents and so on. This would seem to be a pretty far-reaching step, but a workable one in your impression?
Well, it's workable other than for all the people who are going to have to get a new birth certificate if they want to have a birth certificate. It's inconvenient for them. The other point to remember is that this issue, that invalidating existing birth certificates does is address the so-called breeder document problem. So the specific issue that looks to address is that somebody can come and use somebody else's birth certificate and then go and use that to get a driver's license or a passport or whatever. But the identity fraud problem is generally much larger than that. It includes borrowing somebody's data for a fake ID, or sharing an ID with a relative, or renting an ID from somebody. So as Roy just said, we know that right now with E-Verify, it only prevents unauthorized immigrants. It only sort of correctly identifies unauthorized immigrants about half the time, because the other half of the time people use identity fraud to game the system. And probably most of that identity fraud doesn't make use of breeder documents, although we'd likely see breeder documents become a bigger problem with more use of E-Verify. Right now, only about 2% of employers and about 12% of people hired are screened through the system. But if we grow E-Verify outside of doing sort of the rest of immigration reform, we expect that we'll probably see quite a bit more of all types of identity fraud. So it really illustrates how many moving parts there are and how much you have to fit them together to fix the system.
This must be a large conversation, a conversation that looms large inside big immigrant communities.
Absolutely. And in Annapolis also, we had a bill 2 days ago on E-Verify to impose it a la what Arizona has. And testimony was clearly very split. But I think the recent studies of E-Verify show that it doesn't work, that that is not going to be the tool that is going to ensure that documentation that is presented for work is a valid one. I think, just as a comment on identity fraud, clearly there are two different types of identity fraud. The ones that are being used for employment, as you've described, can be a cousin, can be somebody else who gives you their Social Security number, or the ones that are real identity fraud, which is when your identity gets stolen, your money gets taken out of the bank, the real criminal identity fraud. I think we have to make sure that we're understanding and that we have laws that apply to that, because that is the much more serious. It has a victim on the other end. But as we know in our immigrant community, what has been the long-standing way of being able to get an employment is to get chuecas. You can buy them on the corner there, the Social Security number and an ID card with a work permit, and that is indeed something that we need to cut back on. I mean, that I think people have found that that's no longer an easy path to be able to get employment. But we also found that E-Verify can't catch those.
If the other person whose name you're using is alive and has a valid number, and
I found it was interesting that the Social Security system employees were not able to pass the E-Verify. 50% of them were not able to be verified by E-Verify.
Well, that should be a warning to somebody about something.
And this, all of this really does show one of the great difficulties for Mr. Gutierrez and Senator Schumer, who, and the only way that you can really go after, true immigration reform is if you can prove that you can stop this. I mean, otherwise, if you cannot guarantee that the identity theft and the illegal working will stop after that bill passes, then you haven't, the grand bargain's not there. And Senator Schumer said as much. And last summer he says, unless we can prove that we've got the border secure, unless we can prove that after this bill passes you won't have illegal workers, we don't have anything to sell. And I think just this discussion shows how difficult it is to stop that.
Well, I think you'd all agree this is going to be a marathon effort, not one that we're going to wrap up this week, next week, or anytime soon. Thanks for being with us, and I'm sure we'll see you all again.